Now we're moving forward and painting the arm. I have it schemed in from the um, original day that we knocked this in. But before I get too much painted, I am going to need a little bit of toning around it, I've decided, especially because there's so much intense blue around the arm that I feel it would be a little bit difficult to hit the color with the correct intensity and make it glow as much as I want it to glow if I don't have some, at least toning blocked in there that's sort of the right color family. And so I've knocked in some toning behind her. See, it pretty closely matches, at least in the reference photo there. And I'll eventually go back and tone over that with some more color later on in the abstract day section. Now, what I'm missing out on here is the fact that her arm is in a pretty different pose than from when I did the color sketch. Now remember, there was a day, or there was time between when I did the color sketch and when I knocked in that initial drawing. And what I ended up realizing after this drawing was painted in was that um, the arm was a little less dynamic. It wasn't outreached as much, but more importantly, that affected the angle of the trapezius in the back, which before, when she's stretched out a little more, her far shoulder pops back a little more. There's more of a dramatic angle there, and it's less of a diagonal slump kind of look to it there. So as a result, even more so than for the reason of the arm uh, being less outreached, I wanted to actually adjust the back. And I don't think the back could have been adjusted without repainting the arm. And so here's an instance where um, uh, you can't get away with just changing one piece of anatomy that was really the thing that I wanted to change, which was the back. I had to change anything attached to the back, which was in this case the arm. I'm laying this in with a bit of an abache. It's paint that's been thinned with a little bit of turpenoid, or Gamsol in this case, um, just to get an overall feel for the color of the area. Um, and then I do have my color sketch down below. You can't really see it here, but I'm going to use that to guide some of my color choices. And I am really also flipping back between looking at her arm and her head, and then my arm and my head, so I can see the color choices that I'm deciding on here. Trying to do a lot of fast measuring here because there's no telling how long she'll be able to hold that cloth out there for. It's very, very challenging to do that pose. So I'm just trying to knock in as fast as I can with both color and correct drawing. You see me measure I did a comparative measurement of her deltoid compared to her face that I painted earlier. Even though I'm sight sizing this, these are fine-tuned measurements, so I need to see, even though I'm generally the right size with sight size, I want to get a fine-tune, like how many more millimeters compared to the face is that arm. Now the picture-in-picture we just had, and we'll actually bring that back a little later when we do a closer shot of the arm, actually was value adjusted for you to be able to see a little more what I saw when I looked at her with my eyes adjusted. Unfortunately, like in some of the other situations we've seen in some of these videos, she has a spotlight on her. I do not have a spotlight on my painting, and as a result, the camera is not able to focus on or capture the value structure of both her and the painting simultaneously. So when we bring back the picture-in-picture, it's actually exposure adjusted for you to be able to see the correct values and correct colors. And it's a little easier to compare what I'm painting to that reference as opposed to the model actually being right there. Luckily, when I repaint the arm, you'll have that picture-in-picture in, so you'll really be able to see some of the color choices being made a little more appropriately. I'm using thinner to carve out the sides of the arm rather than going in with the blue dress. I'm not ready to completely paint that blue dress in. I really want to give it special attention to opacity and transparency and making sure that the colors are really, really intense in that blue dress. And of course, if you mix blue with little bits of orange, it's going to kill that blue. And so instead of opting to carve out the arm with the fabric color, I'm opting to carve out the arm with a bristle brush and some thinner. The rest of this is being laid in with bristle brushes also. Stiff bristle brushes with body paint, no thinner at this point, and no medium also at this point. I always recommend doing drawing correction changes with thinner and wiping away if possible. That will help keep your colors a little more intense and a little more rich.
So how do you decide the level of finish on the hands?
Well, the hands have to be pretty well finished usually, but it's keyed in a couple different ways, at least for me, and it depends on the type of painting that I'm doing. With this type of painting, the idea is pretty much the further away from the face, and this is by like inch proximity, really, of the canvas. The further away from the face, the looser and hopefully more open the paint film becomes. Um, uh, but in this particular case, um, I'm treating the hand and arm and face all kind of as on the same plane, a little more forward. So I'm going to build up the arm and hand potentially a little bit more than I typically would. But that paint film on the face is pretty closed comparatively. So there will be steps in looseness as it moves away from the face. And then as it gets more towards the bottom of the canvas, it will get really loose and really open. So the hand is like halfway down the canvas, and so the bottom will be twice as loose and twice as open as the hand. In other paintings of mine, it's not necessarily done that way. It can be keyed, if it's a figure painting or multi-figure painting where it's kind of a whole scene there, it's often that they're the same level of looseness sometimes, where I'm trying to keep everything equally open. Or even if it's a really tight painting, I might develop the hands to be quite a bit tighter, almost as tight as the face, if not as tight as the face. It just kind of depends on the type of painting that I'm going to do. But generally, it's a little less detailed than the face. And the looseness is kind of keyed to the face as well, so it's a little more loose. Other than that, I would recommend doing the hand studies that we looked at in some of the previous videos, and just remember that for the hand to be accurate, it doesn't require a lot of detail. It's just the big basic shapes of the hand. I do like to paint hands pretty loose if I can, and so I'll often pose a hand. Actually, how I have it posed now is a pose that's really suited for a pretty loose painting of the hands. Or at least, if nothing else, a very simplified painting of the hand. So that's what I'm kind of hoping to do in this particular case, hit it with as few strokes as I can. But that might change as things go on. I'm trying to put a little bit of the background drawing in more context. And it's just drawn with Willow before, so I'm putting some paint lines in there to help me kind of understand it. But the whole posture is starting to change from my initial design and initial scheme here. Laying in more thick paint, it gets a little bit darker at the sides of the arm. We really have quite a bit more of a direct lighting on this painting, and it's a little bit more like the old kind of naturalist paintings or even old academic paintings. The idea for one of those is that the figure should be in high relief, meaning a little bit more of a front or front above lighting so that it gets a little darker and turns on both sides. And so that's kind of what we're seeing with the arm here. It's not super dramatic. I'm not going to blow it out like it is in the video there, certainly, but there is a value shift where it gets a little deeper as it goes towards the outside of that arm. I still have the same sort of idea with the arm, that I've painted a little extra paint than what the arm will ultimately need, kind of just like with the head also, and I'll use my brush to and some thinner to dig into that arm and crisp it up as needed. Like right now, certainly the hand is quite a bit larger than it needs to be in relation to the face, but that'll be easy to cut into, especially if I'm working in one session. But I do have to cut into it and resolve it before it dries. So in this case, before the end of this session. Again, cutting in there. The arm's in even a slightly different pose than it was before, but I can see a little bit more anatomy, and I'm taking advantage of that. You know, if I can select a posture that reveals a little bit more anatomy in a situation like this, I might opt to adjust some of my painting, unless the feature is in shadow or intended to be in background or in an area where it would make more sense to lose information, then I will take advantage of that also. Notice that diagonal mark, that was me checking answering shapes from one side of the arm to the other, making sure that the angle between the elbow and the antecubital was correct so that I can get the correct tilt. Actually repainting that direction of the arm also, once again. So this is where those anatomy studies are really going to come into play here. You know, I'm trying to hit something that's kind of like a moving target very fast in a particular style. If you have not done all those anatomy studies, this is going to be a really challenging thing to do. If you're only used to working in a slow built-up process where you're allowed to come back and correct things as needed, then this is going to be very, very challenging because you have to try to be pretty immediate with something like this. But, you know, again, certainly a little more advanced. Working with a model in a more demanding position like this, we've had lots of situations in class where we've put the model in a more demanding situation, and then, you know, the students have to learn to try and adapt to that. And sometimes we make accommodations like we're making here with Dakota, where, you know, she only has to go for 10 minutes or something and then take a break. But still, there's a lot of adjusting to be made, and you know, sometimes we have students set up the poses, and the poses are a lot more demanding even than the student or the model might realize, and then we just have to learn to adapt to that. You know, any standing pose, for example, is going to be much more challenging to hold than any seated pose. Any pose with twists and turns is going to be a lot more challenging. You have to learn to expect subtle shifts and changes, and that's where working from the model for a long period of time really pays off, because you learn to, hopefully, learn to adapt to some of that, so that when you're doing your own paintings, you won't be completely in the dark. And, you know, we could work from a photo in a case like this, but then, again, we might not get as much color. You know, I'm getting a lot of good, subtle color information here that I might not get in a photo. You will certainly be subject to whatever your skills as a photographer are in this case. But I am doing a lot of stepping back. You know, my palette is right next to the canvas, so anytime you see me leave the frame, that's me stepping back, observing, thinking about what I'm going to do next. I'm spending almost as much time stepping back as I am mixing the color, and even less time applying the paint. So, you know, there's a lot of observation, a lot of thinking that's going on here. But it's all happening very quickly. And we're also in a little bit of a dialogue, at least James and I. and occasionally Dakota as well.
Is that her wincing in pain? Like,
I think she's actually using her eyes to see the placement of her hand.
okay.
Yeah, opening one eye and looking at her hand and seeing where it falls against the floor, and then opening the other eye and seeing where it falls against the floor. She's trying to. I think at this point we've said we'll really try to zero in on one position so we can nail it down. I'm not even really sure what poor James over there is doing. He must just be chasing it from day to day. But I know that if I just get a little bit of time, 10 or 20 minutes to sink the drawing in, then I can adapt a lot of the colors that I see on her to the drawing. But I really need her to remain in the same position for just a little bit. So she's trying extra hard to keep that hand in the same spot. Unfortunately, what's happening is to do that, she's shifting a lot of her body. And so the upper arm and shoulders are swaying a bit and rotating a bit in her effort to keep the hand in the same spot. And so really it's not working out quite as well as we'd hope.
Mm-hmm. That's too bad she's not resting her hand on anything, her arm on anything.
Yeah, but we needed, the problem is I needed the muscles to be activated for it to not look in rest, which it would not make sense that way.
Do you have photo reference, or are you using your anatomy knowledge for this?
Oh, just my anatomy knowledge. And actually, I'm not really doing much of anything other than scraping the paint.
Okay.
At this point, it's too wet to scrape. I'm actually smashing the paint into each other and into the tooth of the canvas, but very delicately. It's not arbitrarily. And really just affecting some transitions by pulling paint from one area kind of into another and into the canvas. And so it actually will maintain a very, very clean transition this way.
Mm-hmm.
The colors actually tend to be cleaner. Your value transitions tend to be more subtle, and you don't accidentally pick up paint from one area and distribute it in another. So just by doing this subtle scraping, and this is something that we see and you can revisit and rewatch in the limited color master copy from first term, this is going to allow me to get some of these more subtle transitions and variations. And then when she gets back up there, I can sink in some more final details in that area. Keep in mind also that when I step back and see her, I'm at a very different angle to her than the camera is to her. So for example, as I go in and try to work that neck as I just was, the neck and head look like they're at a completely different angle from where I'm standing back and observing than from where the camera is. Trying to sneak some of this anatomy in here, show the turning of the form, a little bit more color at the core shadow. And again, I'm just trying to lay paint in, really get paint nice and thick in there with the intent that I'll be able to just scrape it or smooth it down and then maybe add a detail or two or maybe just be done with it. Again, more drawing correction with thinner. I attempted a little earlier to place some color notes there. I didn't like how the edge quality was coming out, so I removed that greenish color that I had. I also wasn't yet ready to spend the required amount of time to hit that color just right, so it didn't make sense to leave it in. Something we talked about before, jumping to a new area, spending upwards of a minute just mixing a new color in there. That's not something I want to have to spend time doing while she's holding her arm out like that. we've seen from the drawing here how important these subtle little angles and tilts and overlaps of the arm are, especially in a female that's a little more delicate and not super pronounced. And so I'm continually spending time going back and really looking at that shape to try and cut that in as nicely as I can. Again, lots of pure body paint here. Even there where it looked like I was just softening the stroke, that was actually applying paint, not softening. It's just that it's so close to the surrounding color and value that it looked like I was just mushing that lighter color paint into the arm. The strokes that I'm starting to lay down now are really trying to be more directional, following the anatomy. Trying to get as much kind of work done as I can in a limited amount of time. Follow the anatomy while you're laying in the color. Again, it's a little bit more of an advanced concept because you have to, again, be multitasking, thinking about more things at once. But that's going to help me suggest more anatomy more quickly, more structure. So in these instances where she's relaxing a little bit more and sitting up a little bit more, being a little more casual, I'm actually just taking more color notes and following my painting that I have there, as opposed to actually changing shapes that are there. And that's something that I think is important to learn, especially if you're working with a model, and especially over a very long period of time working with a model for a multi-session, multi-day pose. Because we don't want to necessarily be chasing something unless something really needs to be corrected. And if you have a good solid foundation, you're confident in your drawing, and this is why doing a shadow map ahead of time would really pay off, then you don't have to shift what you have on your painting. You can just take the color notes that you see and apply them to the appropriate spot on the painting, and for the most part it will work out pretty well. Again, we have a little bit of a break, so I'm taking the time to scrape down some of the painting. Um, it's a little bit difficult to see from this distance, but you can still kind of make out how there's just little tiny variations in color up in there, and that's largely happening because of the scraping that I'm putting or executing right now. So this approach is something that we see in paintings by some artists such as Godward. We can see evidence of the scraping. Bouguereau did it quite a bit, but in multi-layers, for a multi-day session to get a lot of little subtle variety, at least in some portions of some of his paintings. Certainly not all of them. He had a lot of different painting techniques that he employed. But we can definitely see this in paintings like The Birth of Venus and all the subtle variation in the colors of her flesh tone, whereas all the figures sort of behind her in the distance are definitely not painted in this way with the scraping. They definitely don't have all that variation. They have a little bit more of a slick, smooth, direct, or even glazed appearance to them. But this is a great way to build up texture and variation and subtlety in a painting, something that a lot of academic painters employed in their work. Seeking out the anatomy here, remembering that the ulna gets a little harder, or the wrist gets a little harder down where the ulna passes over the muscles underneath. So a lot of that edge variety, that round versus angular that we learned in all that Bridgman, we definitely tend to pick up on that in the arm and the forearm. You can see how short the dress actually is without that fabric down there. Got a little bit tighter shot on the arm here, so you can start to see some of the little variations in that brushwork that we were talking about. It certainly adds a more natural feel to it, definitely less plastic. Notice even how I'm holding my brush to lay down a lot of the stuff. If you're using a textured canvas, especially one that's a little less slick and potentially a little more absorbent, and you're wanting to use this body paint to really lay it down and build up this almost sculptural form with the paint, then you treat it how a sculptor would hold his knife. You're really laying on and sort of pushing and carving out the form here, as opposed to just, delicately dabbing or licking. There's some areas where I'll go in and be a little more specific, but for a lot of this application, I'm just really scraping it on there.
We've talked about the differences between licking and repeatedly using the same paint in multiple strokes without getting more paint, and using your brush to alter a stroke you just put down. Could you talk about that a little bit more here in relation to carving out strokes?
Yeah, sure. It's the same idea that we're not doing things mindlessly. I think that's what it really comes down to. If I do lots of multiple strokes, it's usually because I'm blocking in an area. If I do 2 or 3 strokes, it's as you said, I'm laying down a piece of paint or I'm manipulating a particular stroke. And the carving out is the same kind of way. I'm laying down some paint. It may come into a situation where I have so much paint on there I can push it and manipulate it a little more like clay. But that really does require a large volume of paint on there and a little bit more of a textured canvas where you're not just going to scrape off down to the bottom layer. I think it's a little bit more of an advanced technique to do this idea of kind of carving and scraping with the brush, sort of more like a blunt tool as opposed to a delicate tool. Something I certainly would have been able to do when I started painting. And if you're not used to working with wet paint and you're not used to a more textured absorbent surface, it's going to be something that's really challenging and difficult to do. But whatever method we use to apply the paint, I think it's most important to just be really mindful of what you're doing. And if you find yourself doing more than 2 or 3 strokes on the canvas, you really need to stop and do whatever means are necessary to avoid that licking of the canvas. I mean, even in the last video that we looked at with the 3-session figure painting, we talked about this concept a little bit, but you can see even in the background on the left, there was a student there who really got a little carried away with some of the licking of the canvas, and you can count upwards of 70 or 80 brush strokes that are going in at a time without picking up any paint, without changing the direction of the stroke. It's just 80 vertical strokes all right next to each other, and it certainly doesn't improve the quality of the painting. It just destroys the colors and destroys the value. It just stretches out the paint so much that you lose all of the positive qualities associated with oil painting. And those qualities of either transparency or juiciness or textural and sculptural buildup, those all get destroyed by licking the canvas with multiple mindless strokes. I've tried to get her to adjust her posture. As you can see now, she's leaning way forward. I want to paint that back in the shoulders and trapezius. And I think it's really only at the end of the day, when I look at how everything came together, that I start to have this feeling that the anatomy is not really connecting as well as I want it to, and I'm not getting the gestural idea that I want in the painting, and that's why I'll end up going back and adjusting some of the stuff.
But you don't repaint the arm again, do you?
Oh yeah.
You do?
Yeah, this arm is destroyed.
Oh, no.
But, and I can see how that produces a lot of anxiety in a lot of people, especially if you get an arm on there that looks nice, or a face on there that looks nice, or whatever on there that looks nice, to have the courage to say, well, it's just a little bit not what I want, and let me destroy that. It takes some gusto, but you'll notice that the top painters will do that. If it's the difference between, this is what I always told students when I was even teaching at the Palette and Chisel, the difference between a good painter and a great painter is that a great painter will repaint and correct as they need to make the painting better, whereas a good painter will be satisfied with what's there. And you can be a good painter and leave, like, this will be a good painting, it'll be okay if I leave the arm there, but if I want to make it a great painting, I've got to do whatever is required. Even if it's, for example, costs more money, an extra $50 for me to do it, because that's an extra amount of time I have to spend with the model. Even if it'll cost me more paint, more time, more anything, if I feel that it will be an improvement, then I will do it. I'd certainly behave a little different if it were an alla prima painting. If it were an alla prima painting and this were all being done at once, I would say, well, I guess I'll just repaint the whole painting. If it's not quite as strong as I want and it's an alla prima, well, just redo the whole thing. But this is a multi-session painting. I've already committed a lot, especially in terms of the color sketch, the building the canvas, painting the face in. Just redoing the arm seems relatively small in comparison to redoing everything else. The, I think, positive thing, though, that comes out of it is that I'm able to do, I think, the arm and the hand all in one session. Whereas I think with what we're going to see here is that I don't actually have time to finish the hand because I spent so much time on the arm.
Oh, no.
And here we go. The tilts weren't right, the angles weren't right. I wanted a more dynamic gesture. It didn't make as much sense with that back arm. I wanted that to see a little bit more with the back. So we're repainting. Luckily, I have all that experience I gained from painting the arm the first time. The colors don't really change as much. The pattern of light and dark on her doesn't change that much. So really, it's just the angle that I'm changing, and a little bit of the angle of the back. And so it's not that it was a complete waste. I certainly gained a lot from that first 3 hours painting with the model. And so now I'll be able to come back and do this a little bit stronger, a little bit more directly. And
you are working with the model again? You're not working from photograph?
Yeah. Yeah, we might have modified it a little bit. I may have given her a little bit more breaks, actually, shorter breaks, but just more frequently. And I'm certainly being much more vocal with having her get in the pose that I need her to be in, for sure. But we'll see that it should go on a little more smoothly. And again, just having the experience from before of painting it is huge in being able to paint this more accurately a second time. I have so much um, old scraped paint on there that I can't do my normal method of using the mineral spirits with a bristle brush to carve this out, so I am going to have to go in with some color of the fabric here, at least some placeholder color of the fabric. But I'm just really blasting this paint, and it's still pretty pure paint. There's a little bit of thinner. There's a lot of thinner in the blue, but in the flesh tone there's a little bit of thinner, and I'm just using a bristle brush and really just scrubbing and working. You know, we have a tighter shot here, which you know, it's a little awkwardly cropped, but at least you can see a little more how firmly I'm laying in some of this stuff, how I'm doing some of the scraping manipulation. A lot more of the brush application is visible in this sort of cropping. You know, I had reviewed the footage from before. It was nice that you kind of see how it was overall working out, but it would be nicer to see some of that application. So we got this tighter cropping here. And we're working with more of a full body paint block in here as opposed to an emboss when we actually get working into the arm. So it's a little bit different than the face, but still somewhat similar. And again, it's just going to be body paint thrown right on there, really firmly, not timid at all, just blasting it in there. So this is closer to the whole angle that I want for this arm. So it's already starting to look a little bit better when I step back, at least a little closer to my color study. You know, one of the things I saw between when I painted the arm last and painting the arm now is the color sketch was just so different. It's so much less, or so much more dynamic than the painting was turning out that you know, that you kind of lose the energy and the desire to do the real painting when you see it's turning out that static. And so you know, doing all of this, you know, getting it closer to my color sketch really helps to revitalize me in wanting to actually paint the picture. And I'm also doing a lot more comparative measurement at this point too. Um, I think one of the things that I realized before was that site size was a little too challenging because with the amount of moving that's happening, locking into the pose doesn't really help because there's too much shifting that takes place. It's comparative is a little more logical at this point because the length of the arm stays pretty consistent to the size of the head no matter where the arm is at. So comparative is going to work a little bit better and a little faster than site size. Now we're just laying some nice thick paint in here. I'm trying to hit the biggest shapes that I can first to really lay in the color and get the drawing in there before zeroing in. So, you know, I've got this nice, really big bristle brush, one for the background area, one for the actual arm area, and just trying to really knock in bigger chunks of paint.
So you've divided your brushes into the arm and the background? rather than dark and light?
Yeah, well, right now the values that I'm working with in the arm are pretty similar until I hit those highlights in. But so at that point, I might pull in a different brush for the lighter areas of the arm. But at least it started out. I still always have one for the background. So there's usually at least three. So if this were, any other Open Studio figure painting, I would have a light brush, a dark brush, and for the flesh tone, and then a background brush.
Okay.
Because there's some instances when you want to come in with a little bit of background to carve some shape, but you don't want to have to refine the whole color, and there's still a little bit of color left on your brush. It's easy to go in and correct with that. Right now, the arm looks a lot like how it did in my color sketch, which is kind of nice because I can use some of that color sketch as a guidance to at least how to initially lay paint down to make sure I hit the right colors and right gestures of the pose. So it's times like this, if the arm gets a little too heavy or hard for her to hold it out, I'll let her lower her arm and just lock her body back into the position it is in my color sketch now so that I can go up and paint some of the neck. And then when she's got a little more strength and she can hold her arm out, then I can go back in and paint the arm.
Is James still painting at this point?
Yeah, I believe he is. I don't think he actually ended up finishing this painting, though.
Oh, that's too bad. But was he working other areas when you were saying, like, oh, you can relax your arm a little bit?
Yeah, well, he was bouncing all over, so I don't
Uh-huh.
think that would matter too much for him. Especially since, in this case, I'm bouncing a little over too. It's not as though I'm painting just one area and letting her move everything else. I'm pretty much bouncing all over and letting her move one area. So that's a little easier to cope with. Now that I have a little more of that back and trapezius set up, it is easier to make sense with the anatomy flowing into the arm and the shoulder. Totally changes the gesture of the pose, the tilting and the leaning. I was missing all that leaning. It looked just more like she was holding her arm out and not leaning into a pose and reaching down. Really thick. You can see how thick I'm laying this paint on. And if I'm going to plan on scraping it or softening it, it's not a big deal because I do have a very textured canvas. So I can make this as smooth as I want, even though I'm laying in this really, really large amount of paint. I think there's a misconception that some students have that if you want something to be smooth, that you have to be laying the paint on thin. And that's not always the case. There's ways to manipulate the paint after the fact to get the effect you want. And often if you go too thin, you just sacrifice your value and color quality. I kind of remember the order that I laid the colors on and kind of what colors I was leaning towards the first time I painted the arm. Um, so I'm able to jump into those mixtures, I think, a little bit faster, and thus I'm able to bounce around the arm a little bit more, which is kind of nice. Um, I can really get an overall impression and sense, which is really important. If you can do this really fast, and it's been a relatively short amount of time that this arm has been blocked in, that's a lot of color information, a lot of drawing information that can be used to guide the rest of it. So now, even if she does start to move a little bit, which at this point she is starting to move a little bit more. We're in almost an hour or more into this session here. I can just lay the color again on top of this drawing and be pretty confident that it'll look correct, and then just fine tune it with my understanding of anatomy as I need to. This is kind of the bread and butter of the alla prima direct painting, is sort of to get this immediate impression of what's there. And even as a more studied or academic or classical painter, you should be doing a lot of quick, fast things, alla prima studies and color studies, because the more quickly you can arrive at an immediate impression of what you're looking at, the faster you will get to jump into all of the more subtle complexities that something is made up of. And there's an interesting disconnect that I think some students have with this idea, like, oh well, it takes me a long time to arrive to the solution, so I'm not going to be an alla prima painter. I'll just putz about until I get the right answer, and that they associate that as being very different than an alla prima painter, when somebody who paints things over a long period of time to get the right solution. But what you'll find is that those artists, both contemporary and historical, who are really good at paintings that are really fleshed out and developed and highly realistic and rendered, they're also really good at getting an immediate impression of what's there. And that's one of the reasons why their paintings look so great, because that foundation is just so strong that the little tidbits that go on top of it are also in the right spot and keyed correctly already. And so there's a lot of accuracy through all stages of their work. It's not like they're needing, a whole month to get something to the point where it looks good enough that they can start adding detail. They're getting that right away. And so the students that dismiss alla prima because they think you have to, you have to get the impression right away, and instead opt for something else because they think they don't have to get the impression right away, end up having very, very weak paintings overall. So regardless of what style you're working in, you should be trying to do these quick studies. You should be trying to do color studies. You should be trying as best as you can to get this immediate impression as soon as you can. And then you can opt to either leave it in the case of a more loose, direct, impressionistic painting, or flesh it out and add more detail and more subtlety and complexity to get the more studied academic look. So don't dismiss this idea and just say, oh well, you're doing that because you're good and you can. This is what we should all be trying to do, and then it's up to you how far you want to take that. You can tell how many breaks we end up taking with the model because each time that camera transitions into a slightly different angle is typically a break with the model. So we do have quite a bit of breaks. We want to keep her as fresh as she can be over the course of the next hour or hour and a half here that we have with her. So remember, it looks like I'm softening edges here. I'm absolutely not softening edges. I'm still applying paint. This idea that I'm going to add more and more paint to get closer and closer and closer. to where the values and colors need to be. And whenever there's a transition, and this happens sometimes, like the strokes that I'm just laying down now, I lay down a stroke and it looks lighter on the left side than it does on the right side, lighter on the left, darker on the right, in that upper arm area. And that's actually not because the stroke has a varied value or anything in it. It's because the values on the right side of the arm were significantly lighter, the values on the left side of the arm were significantly darker. So when you lay a stroke down that's one value, by comparison, the left side looks a little too light, the right side looks a little too dark. Now there's a temptation there to just soften that stroke out into the surrounding area, but then of course you will destroy the color and some of the value clarity. So if you identify that that's happening, if you can really clearly see these, like that stroke I just laid down, those pieces of paint there, that's indicative that you need to just mix at least two other intermediary strokes, one for the left side of that stroke and then one for the right side of that stroke, and that'll help fold it into the painting there. Again, that same stroke did the same thing, so I had to mix another stroke and then another. I tackled the right side first and then the left side second. I am being aware to try and keep my values deep enough at a good value range to be able to describe color. It's really, really, really easy in situations like this where we have an intense light on the model to start to really pump in that white and get those values on, in this case the arm, lighter and lighter and lighter to try and mimic what we see. And then you just really start to lose color clarity. And I'm detecting a little bit more chroma in this situation than I might on a really fair-skinned Caucasian model. And to be able to get this chroma, these rich golds and rich oranges that I'm detecting, I cannot paint it as light as I'm seeing it with this blinding spotlight on her. I have to make sure I key down some of these values to be able to describe the chroma appropriately. And working that palette knife there, knocking down some of the ridges and some of this paint, just trying to transition one color into another color without having them outright blend too much or mix too much. I do want them to soften, I just don't want them to really mix. When you do this, you can sometimes even get a sort of broken color, almost dry brush effect where, you know, because the canvas is so textured, you're pulling some of one color kind of over another color, but you're allowing that initial color to kind of sparkle through. So you can end up getting that nice texture if that's your desire, or if you have enough paint on there, you can just, you know, smooth it out, kind of like a cake decorator smooths out the frosting on a cake.
Would you leave it smooth like that, or would you plan to go back and paint more on top?
It completely depends on the texture, the area that it's at, and what I'm painting. So for if it's a shadow area, I'll probably just leave it. If it's an area where I want to build up more of a sculptural or textural quality, I'll probably come back over it.
Okay.
See how just soft and smoky and clean I can get these edges just by utilizing the knife instead of a brush. This is not something I've always done. Certainly this is something that I picked up in the last couple years. But it's very, very useful for this type of painting. Keep in mind that you will need a decent knife here. I think I'm using one by Langnickel. And it's an older one, and it's pretty nice. There's the blade has a little bit of flexibility. That's something you have to concern yourself with. If the blade is too rigid, you may end up just scraping your paint instead of kind of softening it and molding it around. And the blade also has to not have any ridges. It has to be clean and very smooth, almost like you could cut with it as opposed to scrape with it. Some of the cheaper knives have this little ridge all around the knife, and it really damages your paint film. I am softening some of this out, so the knife didn't completely blend or remove all of the texture, but it did set it up so the colors and values are closer together. And now, actually, I'm just going with a soft bristle brush, which is actually a little more necessary in instances where the paint is built up like this than a really, really soft brush like a mongoose or a synthetic, because I've got so much paint here and the paint is kind of tacky. It's almost like I'm pulling it. It's a push and pull sort of thing. This was actually similar to what records of Rembrandt painting are like. He would paint and paint and paint beyond kind of the point he should paint, and his paint started to get really tacky and really difficult to manage. He'd come back sometimes the next day even, and when most artists would leave it at that stage and come back until it was dry, he would still try to manipulate and take these brushes and kind of drag and pull and get kind of this tacky quality in some of the paint. And that's how he achieved some of those effects in his paintings, actually. Again, just kind of smashing down some of this color into the tooth of the canvas, giving myself a nicer, softer base to go on top of. And now I feel like I have a good, really good solid base layer that details can be set on top of. Sometimes this would be the end of the session for me painting. In this case, I'm trying to still do this all in one session, so it's a little harder to do that paint manipulation with the knife and then go right on top of it because the colors are still quite a bit more wet than if I were to, say, have waited a few hours or until the next day to do that work with the knife. But with a light touch, it's definitely possible, and then you can just work the session all together. I'm realizing the need to get some of, so a little bit more of the anatomy of the neck and trapezius and deltoids described to indicate the actual gesture and posture of the pose. So I'm just carving in. The drawing never ends, even if you've done a really solid preliminary drawing. As I'm laying this paint down, I'm making sure that I'm doing it delicately enough and with my brush at enough of an angle and with a good enough amount of paint load that I don't disturb the colors and layers underneath, which I just worked on, which are still very, very wet. If you use too thin of paint, then you have to press too hard to get that paint off the brush, and then you end up destroying all that previous work. So you really have to have this understanding of how much paint should go on that brush. I'm getting into some finer shapes, actually with a filbert bristle, and I like a filbert bristle for laying paint on, especially at a stage like this of the painting, because you can use a relatively large brush. That filbert has a rounded or beveled, I guess, dome-shaped kind of tip, and sometimes they even come to a bit of a point, and that becomes really great for creating a variety of brush stroke sizes, especially when you're laying on thicker paint like this. So I can do big broad marks, and then I can get on the tip of that brush and do some nice tiny marks, and it flows really well and does well with that variety. I know we've talked about it before, but this is definitely not how I would do an alla prima. that I intend to have a little more direct and open with the paint film. And one of the reasons I'm not painting it that way is that you go from shape to shape to shape, and your intent is not to do a lot of reworking, because if you do a lot of reworking, you lose the transparency and opacity foiling against each other. And in a case like this, where there's a lot of shifting of the model going on, and as such a lot of correction and fine tuning as things go on, it would be much more challenging to paint it in that manner, unless I were perhaps just using a photo for the whole thing. Again, I'm going back in with that bristle now, and I'm softening up some of these transitions.
Are you going to leave the shoulder strap for another session?
Yeah, I'll handle that all on the last session when I paint all of the dress and all the background into each other. I'll treat it in the same way that I treated the hair, as kind of a transition shape into the background, so that I can really lose some some edges and colors into the background. And I'll tend to try to make the dress quite a bit more transparent. I want her to feel really solid against all of this transparency.
Okay.
And that's just a personal preference.
Okay.
It just requires that I have to isolate a lot more and not be influenced by my kind of block-in color of the dress, because it is going to change quite a bit. And it's interesting when you do this, because without the context, sometimes it's difficult to tell the direction you're going. That's why students end up blocking in so many areas of their painting right away, but then they just end up not blocking them in wrong, and they set themselves up with the wrong context. And there's been so many situations where I've done paintings, especially like this, where I have painted a portion of the figure, like the head and maybe the head and neck and chest, and people will say, "Oh, well, it looks kind of weird. Are you going to finish it? There's all this weird, like orange, or in this case, like green on there. It doesn't look right. You need to make sure you go back and change that." And I'll say, "Oh, okay, well, I'll look at it later," or whatever. And then after I paint in the dress and all the surrounding information, they come back and say, "Oh, good, I see you fixed the face." And I didn't touch the face again, but now other people can see it in context to what's around. And that's kind of important thing to think about, because if you're one of those people who say, "Oh, you need to fix the face because it looks weird with that color there," it may mean that you're overriding your actual observation and inputting or using your experience to influence your decision, instead of really painting what's there. And that can be very damaging, because then when you do get the surrounding areas in context put in, the face won't look as good. It won't have the same glow and the same sort of atmospheric quality. It won't have the unity of the lighting condition that makes it look like a more solid, integrated piece. You really do have to isolate whenever you're painting on a section, at least in the very beginning, and really just try to truly paint what's actually there. And then if you're successful, you can get all these pieces in, and then it'll really shine at the end.
Okay. Are you thinking about how the paint of the dress will lay down next to the paint of the flesh that has sat there a little bit longer?
Yeah, and in some cases, I'll end up needing to repaint a little bit of the flesh tone to be able to affect the edge that I want. But it's a small price to pay. I would rather repaint a little bit of the flesh tone, because the paint buildup there is a little heavier and a little more sculptural. So if it gets more paint, it's not a big deal. Versus the dress, if I lay it down a little thicker right now to get the edge quality, and then the color ends up being incorrect, and I have to repaint the dress, and the dress is going to get very heavy, which I don't want.
Okay.
And this is just sort of a personal decision based off of what I think the aesthetic of the painting should have, which sometimes you can't even tell when looking at a photo. I mean, it just looks like the shape and value and edge and color, and you miss out on a lot of the transparency. But it certainly has, I think, an effect when you see it in person on sort of the atmosphere and the whimsy and depth and a lot of interesting other sort of esoteric things. Getting to a few more finishing marks here on the arm, where I'm really starting to try and describe a little bit more of the anatomy just very, very subtly as I lay in some gentle transitions. See me erasing with the back of my brush, always opting to remove paint to correct the drawing and also create that sharp edge. I can't always do that when it's a stretched canvas, though. I have to be quite a bit more careful. Usually I will have to go in with a bristle and some thinner.
Can you talk about your influence for these paintings or this series of paintings?
Yeah, sure. This group of paintings that I have, which we have a catalog for called Beauty in Motion, was is influenced by a lot of different things. You know, I think it originated with uh, my interest in Schmid style figure paintings and paintings by Jeremy Lipking. Sort of this idea that the figure looks pretty resolved, and then there's areas around that are a little more graphic, perhaps, or a little more abstract. And I like the idea of having a figure foiling against something that is less realistic. And coupled with that is this idea that abstraction, to a large degree, can be more universal than a lot of realist artwork. And the danger with some figure paintings, I think, is that you end up painting something in such a context for environment or time period that it kind of limits some of the appeal, or even in what the figures are doing, and it can really limit the appeal. And unless you have a really specific narrative, a story that you're trying to tell that's can easily be read, then figure paintings themselves can just be kind of sometimes generic and less inclusive, I think, in how many people like it and are interested in it. Because if they're not connected in some way to the subject matter and what's going on, then even if it's a nice painting, not a lot of people are interested. And I've certainly found that about some paintings, although I would say the first 5 years or so of me painting and learning how to paint, pretty much any painting that was done well was liked by me. I was really interested in it. And I couldn't understand why somebody wouldn't like a painting that was done well. And now I can kind of understand that, now that I've been around for as long as I have, and now that I've been exposed to so many great paintings and actually gone to museums and seen paintings, I still really like a well-executed painting and really admire it. But I do see why the public in general can get kind of dead to the idea of, oh, well, it's a good painting, but so what? Also this idea that people can sometimes only understand the quality and skill that went into a painting up to a certain level, and then beyond that, they don't understand how much more skill is required. As a student, you need to learn that. That's one thing you have to understand. You can't just assume that anything up to this level of execution is good, and then everything past that's kind of the same. You have to try to push yourself to be the best technical craftsman you can. So swinging back around, coming up with this idea here was something based just off of kind of what I thought was interesting and cool. I've done abstract paintings in the past, and certainly when I've done abstract paintings, they tend to be very popular. If my family members were to hang a painting on their wall, it would probably be one of my abstract paintings, not one of my realistic paintings. And it just goes to show that there's a quality about abstract paintings that we resonate with, in the same way that we can go and drive through perhaps a piece of countryside and just stop because the sun is hitting the countryside just right and the colors are just amazing, and you get out and you just admire the colors and the atmosphere, and there doesn't have to be a story there. You just really like everything you see, the slope of the mountains with the sun rays hitting it, and water sparkling. There's evidence to suggest that we have a predisposition to like countryside and landscape like that, but on just a whole nother level. We can even look at pictures of space and really be enamored by just the beauty of it, even if we don't understand it, even if we don't know what's going on. That's a part of our humanity, is just to be drawn to really beautiful things with interesting variety. And I think that factors into this large appeal that we have for abstract paintings. And so it came down to this idea that I was trying to learn how to paint, and I would spend all of this time trying to get the figure or portrait as nice as I could get it, as technically sound as I could get it, and then devoting a large chunk of time to just thinking about abstraction and design and paint application and color and how things are all foiling together. And that was sort of the root of the influence here. And then beyond that influence, once I had done a few of those on sort of a minor scale, and I started thinking, well, these would be kind of really neat when they get larger, because as you start to scale up pieces, you can really get lost in this voluptuous field of color. And so the first one was kind of a mashup of sort of ideas with Victorian painting and transparent dresses, and this idea of muka with sort of pattern designs and floral elements moving around, mixed with the idea of Schmidt abstraction, and also this idea of more French naturalist even painting of flesh tones being more subtle and nuanced, and sort of merging all of those to create initially just this sketch, this idea that I had on a chalkboard with some colored chalk, and just going back and forth with it and changing patterns and little pieces of flowers and moving it around and just saying, oh, well, if this dress just fell down, it would be this nice, awesome, bouncy kind of rhythm thing, and I would swoop up here, and then there would be this rising up, and then the pieces started to take on a little bit of story content as far as, oh, what is the person doing? And I want there to be some action other than just a person sitting there. And so what's the story? And then how does that story feed into the idea of what they're doing, and why are they reaching this way, and why are they interacting with some of the abstraction around them? And then it takes the paintings to a slightly higher intellectual level, even though they're still largely and mainly intended to be about this idea of just something really beautiful, a person who's really beautiful, a person that we can connect to, and then having this person interacting with this beautiful abstraction all the way around. And it ultimately, I think, started and still is incredibly founded on this idea of, I think this would just be a really cool painting, and I want to mess around with this color, and I would really like a painting of this color on the wall. And so I get to satisfy this idea of just abstraction and paint application with my desire to still really want to paint out a figure nicely, in such a way that, if I just painted the whole thing out to be exactly what's there, it would pretty much be a boring painting. And it would satisfy my desire to paint things out subtle and nuanced, but in the end I would probably be less enamored by the painting. Whereas here I get sort of the best of both worlds. This particular painting, again, I was heavily looking at muka here for some of these design elements, and looking a lot at Edgar Payne for his compositional stems, and kind of trying to merge together some of these. So I've got a strong diagonal in this painting, but but there's also a bit of a circle element that we add in the end, but there's also a strong S-curve going throughout. So there's sort of three compositional stems that I'm thinking about to describe the idea that's going on, and at least to get the eye flow. The concept here is not as strong as some of the other paintings that I've done in the past. This was a donation painting, so it was actually more about the aesthetic than the story, but there is, the story is intended to be analogous to someone who looks like a Greek goddess. It's sort of a Greek goddess of the sea is really what this is about. And that's sort of the play with the title and with the color selection. And she's supposed to look like she's kind of emerging out of the ocean, and the dress becomes sort of the water and the waves around her, and then she's sort of framed by the halo of the flowers and petals around her. So that's kind of the idea, content-wise, that's going into this painting. Aside from just the aesthetic pleasure that's trying to go in here as well.
Oh, wow. You mentioned Edgar Payne and compositional stems. Where are other places, books, resources that people can look to for learning about composition and practicing composition?
Well, I'd definitely look at the back of the textbook. It does have with some resources. Edgar Payne is a really great one. There's another book called The Painter's Secret Geometry that's a pretty decent one that you can get a lot out of, but it gets complex into some mathematics as well. I think Edgar Payne is probably the most accessible as far as just thinking about things in terms of their pattern design. But you certainly would like to back it up with some mathematical elements as well. And so the Painter's Secret Geometry is good for that. Juliet Aristides has in her books some reference actually to that Painter's Secret Geometry book, but also just some introductory ideas into breaking up the harmonics of a painting and how that kind of started, and those divisions of quarters, halves, and thirds. And those are things that we have talked about throughout the videos of this series. And so if you haven't yet picked up one or all of those books, that is something you should really think about doing. Starting your education in design as early as possible will be probably more beneficial to your success as a commercial artist than even learning how to paint something realistically. So.
Okay.
The way this hand is being laid in, very, very similar actually to our hand study that we looked at early on last term. And it's just laying down these big, broad shapes and then coming on top of it with some thick paint and trying to sculpt out some of the abstract shapes of the hand while maintaining some of the edge quality. Going in with the color behind it was somewhat of a necessity at this point to be able to really get a sense for the correct value actually of the hand in the shadows. So that's why I didn't just carve out with my with some thinner around the bottom side of that hand. I really needed to see what the value of the dress looked like compared to the value of the hand to make sure I didn't overshoot it and make it too dark, make sure I could keep enough color in there. And now that I laid in a bunch of paint, it's a little easier to sculpt and push, and so I've pulled out some of my rosemary cake decorating brushes that Michael Klein has in his set, and I'm sculpting around the hand, and then I'm going in with a softer mongoose and getting some finer tuned detail inside the hand. Something we talked about before, what is the level of resolution I'm going to bring this hand up to in relation to everything else? And it's actually not a lot. I think my goal here is to leave it as abstract as possible. And you can kind of see how the amount of rendering on her has slowly mitigated from the neck as it went down to the shoulder. There was still some rendering, but a little less, and then it got down to the forearm. And there's some rendering, but it's still a little less. It's just not as much described there. And then in the hand, I'm trying to get as loose as I can get away with just knocking in some big shapes and then a few accent shapes here and there, just making sure that my edges of these abstract shapes reflect the little bits of anatomy that are going on, whether it's a vein or a knuckle or, down here I'm working on the back of the ulna here. Just making sure that the edges reflect the shapes, because edges are huge in reflecting the actual three-dimensional structure of something. So just to put an abstract shape in there is nice because you can get an impression of what's there, and that's the whole root idea of Impressionism. But to also describe form you have to manipulate that shape you've put down to have a varying edge quality all the way around, because that edge quality is what gives it its three-dimensionality. In this case, some of the addition of a little bit of value and then the softening of that edge is describing the arm wrapping around, and then I just did a little bit on the wrist that really helped push the wrist back and separate it actually from the broader side of the hand and from the ulna. Same thing on that side. It's these little tiny touches that are actually going to help give shape to the forearm and then the wrist. A lot of people forget about the wrist when painting the hand. I know it sounds kind of silly, but we get this forearm and then we get kind of a hand just at the end of it, and the wrist has some angle. There are bones in there, there's shape there, there's some overlapping there, and a little bit of depth and size to that, and that has to be recorded. You can't just go straight from a wrist or straight from an arm to a hand. You have to remember to paint that wrist in. Got a little bit of kind of a generic dark color that I'm using to set at the outsides with my little cake decorator brush here, and that really helps to turn the form and make the arm look like a column. And I don't have to be too specific even with the color. It's nice if I can get in there and really see the color, but it is a really, really small shape on the model, and so you can see I lay it in and then I end up cutting kind of back into it with the light side to sort of push it back towards the edge, just so I can pick up that little sliver of it, and then I go from the outside and carve in so that shape gets smaller and smaller. But it is an important little piece to have, just to help trim that form. It's that high relief look. Having to be really careful in this area not to blow out the value. I almost made a stroke that was a little too light, and I had to go back and make it darker, but it is surrounded by dark on the left and a little dark indentation on the right, so it's a really subtle value that we have to hit right in there. Just be really leery of any small shapes. They're really going to try and trick you in both value and color. This canvas is so textured that I think you can even see the texture still coming through in the arm that I'm painting. And this is one reason that I'm painting it in this way and painting this so thickly. I don't always paint this way, even for these paintings, but that is one of the guiding influences here on how I'm handling it. If I painted thinner than this, I feel like this texture might be a little overpowering. But now, I've done quite a few of these in the series at this point, and since then that I actually will often select a canvas and prepare it based off of my intent on how I'm going to paint it. And so even though these have a very similar thematic quality to what they all look like, and they all look like they belong kind of in the series and this idea, they're all painted just a little bit different. I don't think I've ever painted one of these exactly the same way. Um, but I think that is strong support for this idea that there are other qualities that make something, a painting, look the way it does, and by a particular artist, other qualities than just the mere step by step of how they do it. And I think there's an unfortunate disconnect that people have, especially people who are honestly trying to learn painting um, and become an artist, when we see all of these videos out there saying, well, oh, you get to learn how to paint like so and so, and your paintings will look like this person if you follow by this video and go along and follow and do the step by step. And there's only some half truth there. I mean, there's so many hundreds of thousands of subtle things that an artist is doing that accumulates to create the overall effect of one of their paintings. And the order which you do them can sometimes be dispensed with and sometimes have to be followed very, very strictly. And when we're in class and I'm teaching, I do try to make a pretty strong distinction to some of the students between what has to be done for the sake of accuracy, what has to be done for the style that they're trying to work in, what I feel to be a statement that is a universal truth versus a statement that is just an opinion truth based off of my own. There's a lot of gray areas in there, and that's where people can get confused and end up wasting a lot of time really trying to learn how to paint. Because I've seen lots of artists who will paint on countless different surfaces with different paints, with different brushes, painting different things with different amounts of time periods. And they're usually almost always still looking like they were painted by that artist. And so there's other things that go into it than just the mere step by step. And you look at this catalog of paintings, the Beauty in Motion series, and I think of all my work, it's the one body of work that looks like it's definitely by one artist, by me, as opposed to by a conglomerate of different artists. When we're filming or recording this in my studio here, and we have all my paintings behind me on the wall, and almost every one looks like it's done by a different artist because I'm always exploring, trying different things. But this series, in which I took all of that knowledge from all those other paintings and I put it into all these different paintings, still looks like they're done by the same artist. And it's because of some of my opinions, really, on how I think the transparency should go here and there, what I think the design elements should be, how I'm handling gamuts and lighting conditions and posing the model. And those are things that go into what makes a painting look so much like my particular painting. Something we talked about earlier with the brush application. But it's, to really be able to paint like someone, the first thing you need to learn how to do is paint. Paint accurately.